The lock was still on it. Jim shot the lock off the stone box, opened it up, and there were the $20 gold pieces. They'd been in paper wrappers, and the wrappers just crumbled to dust when they were, touched.
So online with me, I got Dorian Cook, who is one of the old timers, treasure hunters. But besides that, he hung around with the old timers when he was young, and he's got some great stories to tell. He's a man full of a lot of knowledge, and I'm going to call him a national treasure right here. We're going to pick his brain, hear his stories, and so Dorian. With that said, just start us off, kick me off. Tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got involved with this, and a little bit about your treasure hunting adventures.
Well, Terry, thank you very much. I'm trying to get over the shock of actually getting some respect in my old age. uh, it's kind of sad, but the young people think that when you get to be 77 years old, you ought to be on the front porch in the rocking chair on the Golden Living Center.
Yeah.
But that's not the way it works with old time treasure hunters. They usually die with their boots on, not in a rocking chair in the Golden Living Center or in a hospital bed somewhere. They usually go out. A lot of them go out while they're out hunting. That you never quit.
And that's 100% true. There is a lot of stories of the old timers who died out in the field treasure hunting. You're exactly right.
So I was a Garrett dealer at the time, actually, that I met Charles Garrett. And we got talking, and I had some leads on some Spanish treasure buried out in West Texas. And invited Charles to hunt this one site with me. It involved a mule train full of gold bars. And we had a map drawn on deerskin. And a friend of mine had found it in a relative's papers. He had died in an old cabin. He was an old recluse prospector type guy, and he had this map. And I found the location of the map. I found the terrain that it showed and everything. And Charles Garrett and I went out and we hunted Spanish treasure together, and actually found the site where the mine shaft that has the bars in it was filled in. And to expose it, I needed to take a dozer and cut a swath up this hillside and then just take an infrared picture, and the shaft would show up as a different color because it would not be packed as tight as the soil around it. And that was the way we would find sealed shafts and things back in the 70s. So this was, I went on the way back from this trip. Out of the blue, Charles Garrett asked me if I would be interested in becoming his marketing director or marketing manager, as it was called. And I thought that was quite an honor. I didn't have any background in marketing. My only sales experience was selling landscaping, in my business. But I put my landscaping business on hold, and I ended up working for Garrett as their marketing and advertising director for 3.5 years, from 76 until the end of 79. And I loved the job. Got to travel a lot, got invitations from a lot of people to come hunt. And Charlie Garrett knew all the big time treasure hunters, the pros, and they were using his equipment, and they would all come to visit him throughout various times in the year. So I got to meet these guys. He would introduce me to them. And I was, just a little over 30 years old. And these guys were up there in their 60s, 70s, a few in their 80s. And they kind of took me under their wing, because they found a ready student, that I was respectful, that obviously that they saw that I appreciated and realized that their experience was valuable. And when you show the old guys that kind of respect, they will cotton up to you, and
Yep.
literally they'll open the treasures of their mind to you. So I learned in my 30s a lot of things that would have taken me another 20 or 30 years to learn on my own, if I ever learned them at all, frankly. For example, the old guys pretty much told me, they said, now these are guys that made their living hunting treasure. That's all they did, full time, year after year. And they told me that on the average, they hit a good one about every year and a half, and everything else in between was empty holes. And that is a great lesson for anybody who's thinking about going professional in treasure hunting. If you can't support yourself apart from treasure hunting, if you don't have the funds to pay your bills for 2 years, don't try to go professional. Stay
Yep.
amateur until you can do that.
Yep.
Uh, and that's no guarantee that you're going to hit one, but the odds are in your favor that in 2 years, if you've learned the basic skills of professional treasure hunting as opposed to amateur metal detecting, the guy who hunts the top lot at the local park for clad coins, he's a long way from being ready to go out in the field and treasure hunt. And what happened when Forrest Fenn did his thing. He buried that treasure, and how many people died as a result? Got out there and not prepared for the heat and everything,
Yeah.
and contingencies.
Yep.
Um, you just can't hunt you know what? You can hunt an old house site with your emotions all cranked up with gold fever, so to speak. But you can't go into Death Valley thinking like that, or you're dead, so to speak.
We've had a situation here in where I live, the Uinta Mountains. There's a lot of Spanish gold treasure stories, in the Uinta Mountains, and and
Yeah.
and there is a guy just within the last month or two who hopped on a plane. He didn't even tell his parents. He hopped on a plane from Finland, came here to Utah to the Salt Lake International Airport, paid a taxi driver $500 to drop him off into the Uinta Mountains up near Moon Lake. And nobody's seen him since. He wasn't prepared for since then. We've had snowstorms. They said he was kind of a survivalist kid, but being from another country, not knowing the area, and not when they checked the footage of what he had when he came out of the airport, he didn't have enough equipment to survive the weather that we've had, and he's
Wow.
missing, so to think that you're just gonna go somewhere like you said, Death Valley, the Uinta Mountains, and the Superstition Mountains, and just go up there and find some treasure. You got to get prepared. You got to prepare for your life survival in case something happens. And let somebody know where you're going and what you're doing.
Absolutely. Quite frankly, there is such a thing as gold fever. And when
100%. And I've
Yeah,
seen it firsthand, and it's scary when you're around somebody like that. It's absolutely terrifying.
it is temporary insanity, and people who are the best people under other circumstances can become loose cannons, totally unpredictable.
Yep.
Um, there's I met, like I said, a lot of people, uh, and we'll be talking about some if we do any future interviews. But there were two people that I met. One of them was, and I'll tell you their names, they're now deceased. Jim Gable. Jim had been the vice commander at the White Sands Missile Range, which is the biggest U.S. Military base in the world. It's 20,000 square miles. And so he had a pretty big responsibility, very, very responsible man. And I met him in his older age. He was been in his late 60s. And he had a treasure hunting partner named Fred Mott. Fred had worked for the CIA, and he had learned something about some Russian agent or something they didn't want him to know, and they'd actually tried to chemically erase his memories. And I watched him struggle when I was around him. All of a sudden, he'd just stop his talking and look confused and say, "I could almost get it. I could almost remember."
Mm.
And but anyway, other than that, Fred seemed like a nice enough guy, and he and Jim had been inseparable treasure hunting partners for 25 years. And they finally actually found one. They found a stagecoach robbery strongbox, Wells Fargo box. Had been carrying. They had done their research and everything. They'd been looking for it for years, and they actually found it. And it was carrying. The box was full of newly minted $20 U.S. gold pieces from San Francisco Mint,
Mm.
and the lock was still on it. The three guys that stole it managed to hide it, bury it, but they had a shootout with a posse. Posse got on their trail and killed two of them. The other guy was wounded. survived, went to prison, and just before he died, 15, 20 years later, he wrote his sister somewhere back up east. He wrote her a letter and included a map on where he buried the gold. By that time, he'd been in prison so long, they were no longer censoring his mail. Uh, and so the authorities didn't get the map. His sister did, and his sister didn't want anything to do with it because it was stolen money. So she never acted on it. The map somehow got into the hands of Jim Gable through the family. And so he and Fred, it was a little vague, and he and Fred looked for it for quite a while, and they found it. And they got it out of the ground. I had to pull it up out with their vehicle because it was super heavy. It's not like in the movies where these guys have a strong box, and they're one handing it up on the saddle or something. It
Yeah.
didn't work like that. Well, the lock was still on it. They both of them carried pistols for rattlesnakes. This was in Oklahoma, and Jim shot the lock literally off the strong box, opened it up, and there were the $20 gold pieces. They'd been in paper wrappers, and the wrappers just crumbled to dust when they were touched. And he heard the hammer of Fred's gun being cocked behind him, and he turned around and looked, and there was this wild look in Fred's eyes, and he said, "It's all mine." And Jim told me, he said, "I thought I was dead." He said, "I thought he was going to kill me." He said, "So I got up with my hands in the air, and I said, 'Okay, Fred, it's all yours.'" And he said, "I started walking away from him because if he was going to kill me, I wanted my bullet wounds to be in my back so they would know it was murder and not a self-defense thing." He let him go. He didn't shoot him. And they, lived in the same town. He saw him many times over the years, but he never got a penny. The guy,
Wow.
kept it all. Uh, but there was a happy ending for Jim. Jim got him much younger treasure hunting partner, a boy in his 30s, and they had other leads that he and Fred had been working on. And in the next 2 years, they found two more caches of gold coins.
Cool.
So Jim came out good, and that young man, by attaching himself to the old time, the guy, the expert guy, he came out really good at a young age. But not all stories have happy endings,
Yep.
So you got to be really careful choosing your partners.
Yep.
So, here I was, the only guy in the metal detector industry in the mid late 70s that did not have a degree in marketing. I didn't have a college degree. I started college, and I was taking a public speaking class, and all the professor did was tell dirty jokes and mix company. I wasn't learning how to speak. And I said, "This is ridiculous," and the guys in the class told me, said, "Man, all you got to do is laugh at these jokes and you'll get an A." I said, "Yeah, but I won't know anything about public speaking." So I dropped out. And so I'm kind of self-taught in that sense. I've read thousands of books, and I've written 5 books, working on my 6th one right now. I write since I retired from my business after 44 years. One of the reasons why I went in business for myself is because when you're not on the other man's clock and opportunities present themselves, somebody calls you and says, "Hey, I've got a hot site, but we got to hit it because the bulldozers are going to be in there in 2 days or 3 days." I could reschedule my work for a couple of days and go do it. And I've never regretted that decision.
Yeah.
If there's one thing that I would tell anybody listening, buy back your time. You spend your life working on the clock for the other man, a lot of opportunities are going to slip through your fingers.
Yep, you're
It's not
right.
all, yeah. So get you a side hustle going and work it into a business and buy your time back so you can decide when you go to work and you can decide when you quit. I might go out for 2 or 3 days in the middle of the week to hunt a hot site, come back, and the next week I might work, 4, 5, 10, 12-hour days to make up for it.
Yeah.
If I need to do that, get back on schedule. But see, that flexibility, if there's nothing else that a professional treasurer must have, he must be flexible. He must be able to, go with the wind, not be blown away by it. But you have to learn to be prepared for unexpected disappointments, obstacles, things like that. They're going to be there. And some projects, I'll tell you what, there is a tremendous amount of wisdom for treasure hunters in that song Kenny Rogers did, "The Gambler." You got to know when to hold them, know when to fold them, know when to walk away, and know when to run.
Yeah, you're
Right?
right.
That's right. If you're hunting a lost Dutchman and a bullet uh, chips the rock about 3 feet in front of you, that's the time to run.
Yep.
Forget the lost Dutchman, find you another treasure project, right?
Yep.
So, yeah, I guess now you're pronouncing that Unata Mountains,
Uinta.
Uinta. Thank you.
Uinta Mountains.
Yeah, I had a guy send me a big thing about the Rhodes mine. A whole big
Yep.
package of
Yep.
information.
That's the Uinta Mountains.
Okay. Well, I thought that was interesting, but I was already too old to really get into that project without some help. Now, I did get out 3 years ago. I was up on Mount Cumberland in Nevada trying to help. We were on the ground on the claim where Nevada's biggest gold nugget was found, historically, a 22-ounce nugget. And it's in the Osceola mining district up
Mm-hmm.
there. And the mother lode has never been found. That is the one mining district. So this guy had 15 claims, and we went up there to take a survey, and we got there, and I realized the scope. I mean, the ground that needed to be covered and the work that needed to be done was months and months. Not it would be impossible. It would have been like winning the mega billion-dollar lottery to find that mother lode in 2 or 3 days. So I didn't proceed any further with that project. That's another example of knowing when to fold them.
Yeah.
Say, okay, this is just not the odds for the time spent. The odds against being successful were just too small. So I metal detected to see if there was any free gold in the areas where the geology looked good, and I didn't pick up any nuggets on that trip. But boy, oh boy, we went up the side of this mountain, with a straight drop off in a rented 4-wheel drive, and had to get out and move rocks out of the road to roll off the mountain and stuff. It was quite an adventure, and I
Yeah.
love it. It was really exciting and beautiful country up there. Wow. But Mount Cumberland, I guess, is what, about 10,000 feet, I think, in height. Well, anyway, as the years unfolded, I met some amazing people. Now, back in those days, dowsing was a big deal. And there were about 15 or 20 guys that were making their own brands of dowsing rods.
Mm-hmm.
And I met probably 12 of the top guys that came to Garrett. And they would all tell me the stories about all the gold and silver they found and how they could douse out individual coins in a park. And I've got an open mind on things like that. But as the hillbillies say around here in the Appalachians, where I live now in Kentucky, I was born at night, but not last night. And I got I had a canvas bank bag with $300 face value in silver half dollars. I kept in my drawer, my desk. And when these guys would come in and start telling their stories, I'd say, hey, this is great. I've always wanted to meet somebody who was really expert in dowsing and have them show me how this works. And I said, you just stay right here in my office. I'll be back in about 10, 15 minutes. And we had a 2-acre field next to the factory, and I'd go out there and bury that bag of silver half dollars. And then I would tell them what I'd done. And the first thing I'd notice is every single one of these guys would get a worried look on their face. And I'd take him out and show him a field. And I said, I said, 300 silver half dollars, that should give you a good strong pull on your dowsing rods. And I'd like to show me how this works by finding this. Not a one of them out of the 12 or so that I pulled this on, not a one of them ever found the bag.
Mm.
And they told me, oh, you never heard such a list of excuses. Oh, the sun's too high. The sun's too low. It's too hot today. You've got a negative attitude. There was another treasure buried here that was dug up, and it's giving off false rays, and it's confusing, the dowsing rod. I heard every excuse in the book. but nobody could find a bag of silver $half.
I kind of the same way. I'm open-minded. I think there might be something to dowsing, but I don't know anybody that's ever found anything that's been buried for any length of time. I've watched somebody find a freshly lost ring with dowsing. I've seen that, but
Okay.
I've never I don't know anybody that's actually found something, and I don't know if it's because there's signal of where this drifts and their rods pull them off, and if it does work and they're 5 feet off, they just will be a mile off because they don't know.
Yeah, I found the most honest of the men that I tested was Don Darnell. He made what's called the Darnell rod. And Don was a nice guy. And he told me something interesting. He says, what happens is, he says, your body is an energy source. And he says, you're actually, there's a flow of ions through the rods. And he said, anybody that dowses on a regular basis will have back problems.
Hmm,
And I found that to be true
really?
because I knew other guys that were not in the man. They were just dowsers. They were not making the rods.
Right.
But all that being said, I took various dowsing rods and went up in the Wichita Mountains in Oklahoma. These are granite boulder mountains. I mean, it's right out, looks like right out of a western set or something. Awesome place. Near Fort Sill, Oklahoma, the big artillery capital of the United States Army there. But a lot of Spanish treasure stories in the Wichitas there, and I got pulls on the rods, but I never could pinpoint anything. Now, what I did do, I can take coat hangers, cut them up, bend them into two L shapes, hold on to what would be the bottom part of the L with the rod straight out, and if I walk over like a pipe or even a piece of lumber like a two by four, the rods will cross, and when I step over the other side, they'll separate back out. And I used those in my landscaping business when we were planting trees and things at complexes, businesses that had underground sprinkler systems. We needed to know where the sprinkler pipes were because most of the time they didn't have a map.
Yeah.
And really, we used that. It really worked well. On this one, we had to. They had put too much fill dirt, and they were going to kill all these big trees, so we had to build wells around the trees, and we had to drill these 10-inch drain holes down through the fill, put plastic pipe casing and fill them up full of gravel so that supposedly the root gases would exhaust through these deals. This was an expensive arborist was in charge of the project, and we did the work, and we had a nest of sprinkler pipes everywhere, and we drilled 128 holes, and we only hit the lines twice
Ah,
out of 128 holes, and we did it all with just the coat hanger rods. So like I said, there's something to it, but it's not exact.
right.
And Terry, one of the biggest to me, one of the biggest scams or semi-scam anyway that's going on right now is the aftermarket uh, coils, search coils for metal detectors.
Oh,
You know,
yeah, yeah,
yeah, you put
yeah.
this coil is going to take your stock detector and it's going to go, twice as deep on coins or whatever. Listen, I watched coils being built. The basic principles of coils has not changed since the 70s. I watched the Garrett's coils being built. I know how they're built. I know what they look like on the inside. And I know this. You cannot soup up a coil. Uh, the signal can only be enhanced by the electronics in the box. Coils are just coils. They're coils of wire. And uh, when they press the shell on them, they put them in ours at Garrett's were in a styrofoam template, and then the covers were pressed on and welded together chemically. And if those two coils of wire inside the coil moved even a thousandth of an inch, the coil wouldn't tune to the detector. It had to be thrown away.
Really?
Yeah. And it cost us back in those days $5 to make a coil. Even the big coils were no more than $5, $6, $7. And of course, they sold for over 100 back then. But you're not going to soup up your detector. The only way you can soup up your detector with an aftermarket coil is if it's bigger than the standard coil you're using. A bigger coil will go deeper. A smaller coil will not. You're not going to take an 11-inch coil on a Garrett and replace it with a 5-inch on a super duper whatever, company that says, oh yeah, this is going to really give you more depth. No, it won't. It's just not physically possible. So there's a lot of stuff, like that.
Yeah.
One of the things that was interesting about working at Garrett, I worked up front in the office area, and then the manufacturing area was in the back. Uh, I talked to the people in repair. The head repair guy, Art Garner, was really a great guy, and it turned out that of all the Garrett detectors we got back for repairs, 75% had nothing wrong with them except low batteries.
Really?
Yep.
That's
Of
funny.
course, that was before the day of rechargeable.
Yeah, yeah. That's
Uh,
funny.
yeah, yeah, the repairman told me that. He said, "Yeah, we just put a set of new. You come back and say, hey, so and so sent us this detector." Yeah, I said, "Well, we just put a new set of batteries in. It's working fine." So, oh yeah, and you'll like this, Terry. We had a guy sent back a detector, and the whole thing was crushed and battered, and the stem was bent into an S shape, and he'd beat a rattlesnake to death with it, and he wanted it covered under the warranty. Oh, oh yeah. So we had some good time. I love that job. I just that Charlie Garrett was never known to overpay his hired help, and it got to the point where I could make more money landscaping than I could working at Garrett, and so I reluctantly had to leave the company at the end.
Well, while you
But
was
we had
there,
a very
you probably met a lot of interesting people while you was there.
yes. One of the most was I met the an actual grandson of Jesse James, Jesse Lee James III, and we became close friends. And he was the keeper of all the James family records, photos, certificates, all kinds of stuff. And he lived in Porterville, California. He invited me to come out, and he said he would open the James family records to me. I could go through all of them, which I did,
Wow.
and discovered there's an amazing story there. Uh, History, all the stuff you've heard about Jesse James in the movies and the Jesse James gang, there was no Jesse James gang. It was not a robbers gang. It was part of an underground Confederate resistance movement after the Civil War. And the James brothers and the Daltons and the Youngers were all part of a secret group called the Knights of the Golden Circle, which we'll have a whole program to go into that, maybe two or three. The
Yeah.
subject is so big, so big. But just as a little teaser here, um, they were robbing the banks that were owned by the northern bankers and the trains that were either owned by the northern bankers or they were shipping gold owned by the northern bankers. They were stealing from the North and they saw themselves as Confederate resistors. And then they were taking that money and they would go in and invest it in Wall Street, in railroads and stocks and things and make more fortunes with it. And then those ended up getting put away in secret caches all over the United States. And that's a quick summary of what was going on with Jesse James and Knights of the Golden Circle. But I'll give you a really, really big secret. I've written this. It's in one of my books, the whole story with pictures. Uh, what has messed all the writers up on Jesse James is that nobody has figured out there were two sets of James brothers. There was Missouri Frank and Jesse, and there was Kentucky Frank and Jesse,
Hmm.
and they were cousins. And I have really tracked this down. and I'm absolutely 100% convinced that what I'm saying is true. The real Frank and Jesse James that did all the things, that have gotten into movies and stuff was Kentucky Frank and Jesse. Missouri Frank and Jesse, their real names were Jesse Robert James, and he had a nickname of Dingus. And his brother was Alexander Franklin James. So that was Jesse and Frank in Missouri. And their mother was Zarella Samuels. History says Zarella Samuels was Jesse and Frank's mother, but she was their aunt, not their mother. You
Mm.
know, Kentucky Frank and Jesse's aunt. Kentucky Frank and Jesse, their mother was Molly Dalton, and that's how the Jameses tied into the Daltons.
Ah.
And the story, they lived in a big stone plantation house on the Versailles Pike near Frankfort, Kentucky. And I have a picture of the house, and I have been looking for the house since it's made out of stone in the hopes that it's still standing. Because in the one bedroom where Jesse recovered from a severe wound during the Civil War when he rode with Quantrill, he was in the bed basically for 3 months. And he carved with a big old pocket knife. He carved his name into the thick plaster right over his headboard on his bed, in boredom. And I'd like to find that house and see if that carving is still there because that
Yeah.
would absolutely nail it down. Jesse's father was Captain George James, and we know that a Captain George James was the Confederate officer who issued the order to fire the first cannon at Fort Sumter. And if that was Jesse's father, I don't know for sure yet, but if it was, then Jesse's father technically started the Civil War.
Wow. Huh.
So there's a lot of neat history in that family. And of course, Jesse James uh, was not killed where history said he did. He faked his own death to get the Pinkerton men off his trail. And he took the alias of Jesse Frank Dalton. And you'll see if you go research it for yourself, all kinds of people screaming, this guy's a fake. He's not the real Jesse James.
Yep, they
And yet
do.
all you have to do is and it's available. I've got a copy of it. Is the medical examiner's report on the old man's body. It had 32 bullet scars on it, and it had every identifying mark on the Pinkerton wanted posters of the 1870s was on Jesse Frank Dalton's body after he died. He died at the age of 104. And uh, Jesse Lee took care of him. They lived in Gladewater, Texas, East Texas. And the old man was actually invested in the oil fields there during World War II. But one of my favorite stories, Jesse Lee was a private detective, and so he took care of the old man. And one of my favorite stories he told, he said one day they were out for a walk, and he turned to his grandfather and he said, "Grandpa, how many men do you think you killed in your time?" And he said the old man rubbed his goatee, put his hand up and rubbed his goatee, and he thought, and he looked around, and he said, "You see that big barn up there on the hill?" He says, "Yeah, I reckon they'd fill that barn."
Hmm.
And Jesse Lee was kind of taken aback. He said, "Well, Grandpa, that barn would probably hold 2,000 bodies." And he said the old man rubbed his goatee again. He says, yeah, I think that's about right." And then he said fire came into the old man's eyes, and he looked at his grandson. He said, "But I didn't kill nobody that didn't need killing."
So that had to be probably quite the experience to go in and talk with him, and see all the family history to learn all that. That had to be one heck of a highlight of your life to get to see
It was one
firsthand.
of those, yeah, it's one of those amazing moments. You could have, we talked earlier about how life takes unexpected turns. I held in my hands the diploma that Sylvester Franklin James, the real Frank James, got from a medical school in Missouri. He was a degreed surgeon.
Huh.
And he was the one who saved Jesse's life when he was shot through the lung riding with Quantrill.
Huh.
Because in those times, a lung shot was like 95% fatal. and yet he operated on his own brother and saved his life. But it took Jesse 3 months to recuperate from the wound. Uh, but I held the diploma, and there, I mean, there it is. Sylvester Franklin James, was a degreed surgeon, and I've got the proof right here in my hands. It was I mean, it wasn't something somebody faked. It wasn't a fake document. It was a real thing.
Hmm. So did he? I imagine he told you all kinds of stories that he heard growing up, hearing firsthand these stories and that and
Absolutely, yeah. And he put me on to a couple of the nights the Golden Circle caches of money, and I went to the sites in Arkansas and places, um, and I found everything to be exactly like Jesse Lee described it. He had a photographic memory. But one of the interesting things, Jesse Lee had twin sons, and they looked just like when they were grown up, and both of them were in the Army. There's a picture of them in their Army uniforms. They're in their 20s. And you take those two boys in the picture and you compare it to the picture of Jesse James taken in the 1870s. They're spitting images. There
really,
isn't any doubt. Yeah, there isn't any doubt about the family resemblance.
huh?
It was amazing. Yeah. The Jesse Lee sadly was murdered, I believe, uh, in the 80s, the 1980s. He was in Arizona, staying with a guy who it turns out had former CIA connections, and they were going to try to find one of his grandfather's caches of gold coins out there. And then his sons get a letter from this former CIA guy with a pair of bloodstained glasses in it saying that, your father fell in the shower and hit his head and died, and I had him cremated.
Oh man, how do you do that
Yep,
without family's permission?
exactly. Yep. Yep. So I think Jesse, gave this guy what he needed to find the cash, and the it is possible too that there may have been some other organizations involved in the. Well, let me put it this way: there are government organizations that uh, are in the business of keeping we the people from recovering treasure caches. I mentioned to you that the biggest treasure hunting corporation in the world is the Smithsonian Institution.
Yeah.
And we battled them. Charles Garrett and Roy Lagle got on to what's called the Nez Perce treasure. Uh, I, I'm going on memory here. I don't have any notes. The Nez Perce were trying to get to Canada, and they got cut off by the cavalry as they got close. I think they got within like 15 miles of the border, and they got cut off and they had last battle. Well, the Nez Perce hid all of their silver ornaments and things, all their tribal treasure before the battle. And that's where Chief Joseph made that famous statement that's been recorded in history: I will fight no more forever. Anyway, Charles Garrett and Roy Lagle found uh, there was a sinkhole in the prairie, and it had rock sides, and there was a cave, and the cave had been rocked up with dry stacked rock, the entrance, and it had been broken open. Part of the dry stack wall was still in place, but an opening on one side where somebody could get in. Excuse me. And right above the cave in the rock was chiseled deeply SI 75, Smithsonian Institute 75.
Really?
So, yeah, so they got there too late. The Smithsonian had got there before them and
Huh.
recovered the treasure. Now, here's the point: you can't go to the Smithsonian Museum and find the Nez Perce treasure on display in it. It's
Yep.
not there. See, none of the treasures they recovered are on display. The museum, as awesome and as huge as it is a cover for what they really do, and that is they recovered. Yeah, most of our national forests You know how it is. You're not allowed to even bring a metal detector onto a piece
Yep.
of federal property
Yep.
uh, because I am classed due to the articles I've written about relic hunting and stuff that are in the public domain. I am classed as a professional by the federal government, and if I'm caught with a metal detector on federal property, I can get 10 years in prison and $100,000 fine on the first offense.
Really?
Yeah, that is about 5 times worse than the penalty for rape.
Hmm.
And even if it was a broken detector with no batteries in it, they could still they could still charge me and convict me.
Really?
Yeah, so anybody out there, if you're tempted to hunt on any kind of federal property, don't. Now, if you're just an amateur, they may let you off with a great big $10,000 fine and maybe 5 years in prison instead of 10, or maybe just 1 or 2 years. But do you really want to do that? Is that really what
Yeah.
you want to have as part of your treasure hunting adventures?
Yep.
Yeah, I don't. I really don't. Uh, I won't say that I've never hunted federal land in my younger and wilder days, um, and I've come close to getting caught, but I haven't done that in many, many a year, and I won't do it now, of course, because I can't run. No, it's the thing is, it's the Civil War is thoroughly documented in books and manuals and everything that all survived. I mean, it's the first war where we have all this paper documentation that survived, and the government has millions of artifacts in their possession. And if you remember the movie Indiana Jones and the Ark of the Covenant, right?
Yeah.
And at the end of the movie, you see this guy pushing this cart with the crate with the ark on it down this hallway with all kinds of crates stacked above him in this big 4-story
Yep.
brick warehouse. Well,
Yep.
those are at the Naval Yard just outside Washington D.C. That was a real place. And what's stacked in some of those boxes are Civil War artifacts that were uncovered by the CCC when they built the roads for the national parks and stuff.
Ah.
They uncovered hundreds of thousands of Civil War artifacts, artillery shells, rifles, belt buckles, everything you can think of. Uh, and they've been all stored with no conservation work done on them. The iron will probably have just disintegrated by now. It's
Hmm.
in those cases, and no plans to build the museum space to house them or to display them to the public.
Hmm.
And yet they'll say to we who metal detect, they'll go to the farmers around the national parks and say, don't let anybody metal detect on your land.
Really?
Yeah. And what are the farmers doing? They are damaging the artifacts with their farm equipment, the discs and the plows and things.
Yep.
Uh, and the fertilizers and chemicals they're putting on are eating up the brass items like belt buckles and buttons, all these things. So these relics are just going to be lost.
Yeah.
What would be the harm in letting us go in, rescue them, put them in our private collections? You know what? The relic hunters, the metal detectors, we're the ones that go to the schools and give presentations on history, Civil War history, or colonial history, whatever it's the presentations. But we're the ones that do all the public education, uh, with a few exceptions. The government's got a few museums, but most of the battlefield parks uh, don't really have that much. And the thing is that when you go to the schools, if I go to my local school and I put on a display, I can bring my cases of artifacts and I can explain and show them and let the kids handle some of the
Yeah.
artifacts. Actually, feel how what does the cannonball weigh? What does it feel like to hold a
Yeah.
cannonball? Things like that. See, then the kids get excited about history.
Yeah.
Now, history is being systematically almost eliminated from as being important. But like that philosopher George Santayana said, those who fail to learn the lessons of history are doomed to repeat them, and that is
That's
so
right.
true.
Yeah.
True.
So real quick though,
Okay.
you know, when you met Jesse James's grandson and you got to see all the family records and that, you put one of the books, I think you've written many books. One of them has been on the KGC, the Knights of the Golden Treasure, some of the secrets that you learned, some of that, your book. Tell me about your book. How can
Well,
people get
I
started?
actually haven't written a book on the KGC yet.
Oh, okay.
Uh, in many ways, I'm trying to think. I'm trying to not to walk into a trap here where I trap myself in my own words. I know things about the KGC project that 95% of the people who research it and are interested in don't know.
Okay.
Uh, some of those things, the people behind who are now in charge of those caches and are trying to keep them secure for a they have a future reason which I'm not going to go into today. They might be very upset with what I could put in a book. There are secrets that they don't care if you know, and there are secrets that they don't want you to know. And I know quite a few of the secrets that we're not supposed to know, and they're not comfortable seeing them
Yeah.
out in any kind of a public venue.
Yeah.
So uh,
Well, and and I think you're probably right because back in the '90s, I had somebody contact me. I started a website and I had somebody contact me, and I won't give names or anything, but they told me if I knew it was good for me, I would take that content, those pictures, that content off the internet, and it had to deal with KGC treasure.
yeah, yeah, that's it. You obviously had something that bothered them. You had information that could have led to a recovery of a cache that they wanted to remain in place. So there is a, I can say this much. There is an occult organization with strong religious, uh, what's the word, involvement, motivations behind these caches staying, the big ones anyway, staying where they are for the time being. And because, and this is, I'm not talking about any Christian organization, uh, because of that, they are willing, because they're fanatical about this, they are willing to kill anybody that threatens their plans by uncovering some of these caches. Um, I've talked a little bit about Victoria Peak, the big
Mm-hmm.
treasure out there.
Mm-hmm.
That was one of the big caches that they did not want discovered. And of course, Doc Noss, the discoverer of that cache, I've only found it because there was an earthquake and it opened a crack into the cave system in the interior of Victoria Peak where all the treasure was. And he was able to squeeze through the crack, get in and out. And as the story went, he removed 50 bars, 2 bars at a time, because these bars were heavy. I think, what were they, about 40 pounds, weren't they?
Yeah.
If I remember. Um,
I think maybe they were 80 pounds. I can't remember either, but they was heavy. Yeah.
okay, now Jesse Lee told me that the bars generally that they smelted and put in the KGC caches were either 40 or 60 pounds.
Ah,
I've never, been able to verify that per
right.
se, but I everything that I've ever been able to check on Jesse Lee was accurate. I mean, the guy never lied to me. I've got letters from him, by the way, and we can,
Cool.
in the future, we'll get some uh, pictures that we can get up on the screen. People can actually see his signature,
Okay.
see with my name and where he's written it to me. Like I said, we
Cool.
had we had a very, very good relationship, and I was so sorry to see the tragic end that he came to.
Yeah.
And I always believe he was murdered. I don't believe that story that he fell, and because there weren't any medical records, you know,
Yeah.
uh, the coroner didn't seem to know anything about it, that type of thing.
Yep.
And there wasn't anybody to exhume to check for foul play.
Yep. So What books have you written then? I was thinking you wrote someone. I must have been thinking somebody else. I thought you wrote something of the KGC, but I know you've done a lot of magazine articles. Have you written books too?
I have done magazine articles, and I'm trying to think. Um, I've written for a number of magazines that eventually went out of business. Western Eastern Treasures had quite a few articles, but all my articles for Western Eastern were how to. They didn't want treasure stories. Uh,
Ah,
I wrote for Lost Treasure, and they did, and so most of my treasure stories will be found in back issues of Lost Treasure magazine. And I also I was asked to do a column called the Weekend Prospector, where I answered questions from readers when the guy that was doing it died, and I took it over. And I did that for 3 years in the 90s. Um, my editor told me it was the most popular feature in the magazine. She said they got more mail on that column than anything else.
cool.
Um, but I discovered, we were supposed to be only publishing true treasure stories. In other words, we couldn't tell you that for sure if they'd been found or not, but
Right.
they were legitimate stories. There actually had been or are treasures
Uh-huh.
connected with them. Turned out one of their top writers, this guy had all kinds of respect in that subculture. Uh, all of his stories were totally fictional. He had,
Really?
yeah, he had readers chasing treasures all over the United States, spending money that didn't even exist.
Terrible.
Never had existed. Well, I found out about it, and so I wrote the publisher a letter because I thought, wow, this is going to, if this gets out to the public, that we've been publishing fictional stories, uh, he's going to be in big trouble. And the letter ended up in the hands of his wife, who was having an affair with the guy that I was ratting out. And so all of a sudden, I was
You was
found myself
blackballed, huh?
I was fired on the spot, even though I had the most popular feature in the magazine. I was fired.
Huh.
So, again, that fits in with what we said about life taking unexpected turns.
Yep.
Uh, but I had 3,000 followers at least in the on the column, and that amazed me because it's just like you said, when we were talking about your YouTube channel, you didn't expect it to grow like it did. I didn't think that many people, were interested in a question and answer column, but they
Yeah.
were, really were. If you remember, there was an old timer named Hard Rock Hendricks. You and I
Yep.
discussed a
Yep.
little bit. Well, Hard Rock, I was living in the Cincinnati area at the time, and Hard Rock had come to visit, and I happened to know where an old bottle dump was that hadn't been dug. And so I invited a younger guy who was just learning. He was in his 20s, and I was in my 50s, and Hard Rock was in his, I think, 83, 84. And we went out and we started digging this dump, and the young guy and I were doing most of the work digging the bottle dump.
Yeah.
And Hard Rock got impatient, and he just grabbed me and kind of pushed me out of the way. He says, "Get out of the way, let's move some dirt." And man, the dirt flew in all directions. I'm serious. That was funny. I just, one of my favorite experiences. The old guy tells a guy that's 30 years younger, "Get out of the way. You're too slow." And I thought I was doing pretty good. But anyway, we'll go back to the beginning. And I think, because I know I always like, when I'm listening to interviews, I really like to know the background. How did people get started? Because life takes some unexpected turns for all of us, and they can be good or bad. And I've had many good turns and unexpected turns. And like you and I were talking about, things happen you don't expect, and you get opportunities that you don't expect.
Yep.
And it comes down to making decisions on what to do with those opportunities. There's a lot of wisdom in that old saying, the road not followed, where you come to the crossroads, you can only take one.
That's true.
And you got to learn to pick the correct one most of the time. Um, my metal detecting history goes all the way back to 1972. Let's see, I was born in 47. So that gives me I was about 20, well, I was 23 at the time. as I recall. And I was living in Dallas, Texas. I had a small landscape business I'd started. I'd gone out on my own after working for a couple big companies, and I had always been fascinated by treasure stories. Everybody, and I really want to make this a point. If there's something to take away from this interview, what I'm about to say, I think, is one of the important things. Everybody is, in one way or another, a treasure hunter. It may not be for gold or silver. It might be for antique plates or old bottles or uh, all kinds of things. Of course, some people choose to do it ethically to search for their treasures, and others, well, they push the lines. They cross lines they shouldn't, and people get hurt along the way. But everybody's a treasure hunter. So I think that's in all of us to some degree or another.
I agree with
Uh,
that. Yeah.
yeah, my dad, for example, my dad in his old age, he would go into, he would do the grocery shopping. And he would walk those aisles and look for bargains and see where he could save 5 or 10 cents. And if he bought a can of stewed tomatoes and he got it for 25 cents cheaper than the week before, to him that was like finding a treasure.
Yep. Yep.
It was actually a type of treasure hunting. Uh, but anyway, I remember sitting in barber shops when I was younger, probably I'd say this goes back to about late teenage, 18, 19. And back then there was a man's magazine, which was not, I mean, it would be absolutely mild today by what's put out on social media and in magazines and things. It was a men's magazine called, I believe, Argosy Magazine.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember this one issue laid on the barbershop table with all the other magazines and things. While you're waiting, you just pick up something to read. And here was this guy, he looked amazingly like Indiana Jones. Now, as I think back, way before Indiana Jones existed, and he had that battered fedora hat, and the he had a 45 pistol in one hand, and he had a buxom blonde around the waist with his left hand, and at his feet were a pile of gold bars. And there was a story in there, I think it was just fiction, frankly. I don't think it was a true story at all. But the idea of those gold bars at his feet just really caught my attention. And so I always thought, and then I started seeing in the back of the magazine little ads for metal detectors. One of those was from a company called Detex, D-Tex, and they were located in Garland, Texas, which is a suburb of Dallas. And there was a treasure hunting store in Garland called National Treasure Hunters, and it was run by a man called Ray Smith. And Ray he was well known. He started an organization called the National Treasure Hunters League to promote his business, actually, and he got a lot of followers. He did, he would have been a YouTube hero if he did what he did back then, today. And he carried all the different brands of metal detectors. And so I went over and bought a little Detex Coin King for $100, and that was all the money in the world back then. $100. You spend $100 back in 1972, that'd be like spending $1,000 today. And so I took this little jewel home with me, and read the instructions. There weren't any YouTube videos to watch to teach you how to do it. And I didn't know anybody else that I could go to and learn. And let me make another point that would be a good takeaway. Those of you out there who metal detect that are loners, don't be. Find somebody more experienced than yourself. If you've been metal detecting a year or 2 or 3, find somebody that's been doing it 10, 15, 20 years if you can, and go out with them. And don't get upset when they find more than you do. Watch them, copy them, ask them questions, pick their brains. And you can advance your progress in good finds and metal detecting by years, by 3, 4, 5 years. I can take a beginner, and in 2 days' time, I can put him where he would be after 2 years on his own. I can increase his skills that much in just 2 days.
And what you're 100% right, and why not shortcut your learning uh uh time by getting with some of the old timers that do it a lot and know the tricks, the secrets, and what to do, because it takes a while to learn some of these tips, tricks, and secrets.
It really does. And I have a specific story of an encounter I had with a younger guy on the same site who had a brand new white detector at the time. And I'll tell that in just a moment. But I started detecting my yard. Everybody does. I lived in a little two-story clapboard house in the lower middle class area of Dallas called Casaview. And I thought, okay, I'll start with my yard. And I went over my backyard and my front yard, which was probably uh, not even a quarter of an acre. And to my amazement, I found 38 coins. And I was hooked. I was completely hooked. Now, this is fantastic. So 6 months went by, and I graduated hunting the local school grounds and the local parks. Back then, there were no restrictions. Nobody cared. I mean, the only restrictions was you hunted the schools in summer when the summer vacation was on. You didn't hunt the schools when school was in session. Although you could hunt it after everybody gone home in the evening, before dark. Anyway, uh, I thought I was getting pretty good. By the time I had done 6 months worth of hunting. And so one day I came home and my wife was at the store and I discovered that I'd lost my house key off my ring somehow and I couldn't get into the house. So I thought I carried my metal detector in my pickup and I thought I'll just get my detector out and see if I can't find a few, 3 or 4 or 5 more coins that I might have missed now that I've got all this experience. Terry, in the next 2 hours, I dug 42 coins in just 2 hours in
Huh?
that same yard. I hadn't even gotten half the coins.
Huh? And you thought you'd
And
had it all cleaned out, huh?
yes, and I run into so many of the younger generation getting into detecting today. They're doing that same thing. They're going onto a site and they're spending an hour or two and they're making so many mistakes in the way they hunt and the way they haven't learned what we call read the ground. They're depending on the detector. And here's another point. I'm realizing now I'm pulling points that I put in many of my articles that I've written. Uh, the success in metal detecting, I don't care if you've got a $5,000 wham bam thank you ma'am super duper metal detector, it doesn't make any difference. It's 80% operator, it's 20% machine. I relic hunt with a guy who uses an XP Deus. I went out with him on Civil War battlefield with a Garrett AT Pro, a $600 machine. He had $2,000 invested, and he'd been hunting for 3 years. And we got to a site. It was a 10-acre pasture that the widow who owned it, right next to the state park where you can't hunt on the battlefield. She happened to own a big chunk of one of the hottest spots on the battlefield and been hunted by hundreds of people for 35 years. She let anybody who wanted to hunt, and there had been a bunch of really good hunters in there. And so when I was the XP Deus guys, my buddy, I called him the Viking because he had a big droopy mustache and a shaved head, and he looked like a Viking. Really had a gentle personality, but boy, he looked fierce. And I called him the Viking. And when we got there, he said, the first thing I want to tell you is, he says, you're not going to come in here and dig relics all day. He said, we'll be lucky to find a couple of mini balls for a day's hunt. And I said, well, his name was John. And I said, John, I'm not happy with that. I'm setting my goal, since I don't know this site, don't know the ground yet, but I'm setting it for a minimum of 20 artifacts. He looked at me and laughed and he says, you're crazy. And I said, well, we'll see. And he says, would you mind hunting on the other side of the pasture? He says, I found a little bit of stuff over on this side, and I kind of like to keep this for my area today. I said, fine. I wanted to hunt the other side anyway. What I didn't tell him, number one, I had researched that battle. I knew where everything took place. I knew where every unit was at any given time during the day. The battle was fought all day. And I knew the other side was where you wanted to be if you wanted to find relics. I mean, a lot of relics, because there wasn't much action on the side that he was hunting. He was finding some stray bullets and things, and there was a little bit, you know. So uh, we separated and hunted half a day, and about noon we kind of came back together in the middle. And he looked worried, and I said, "What's the matter, John?" He says, "You've been digging a lot over there." He says, "Are you finding anything?" "I haven't found anything." And I pulled at the time I pulled eight artifacts, mini balls, pieces of cannonball and stuff out of my pouch. And I said, "Well, I've only found 8 so far." And he couldn't believe it. And he says, "You are the luckiest guy I ever saw." I says, "Not luck, John, skill." And he laughed again. He says, "Yeah, right." So he decided he kind of violated what we call unwritten uh, rules of courtesy, and he had to come over and hunt near me. He thought that would increase his fines. So he came over to the side he'd given me, and we hunted together. And at the end of the day, I didn't make my goal. I only had 18 instead of 20, and he had 2. And again, he said, "Man, you're the luckiest guy I ever saw." I said, "No, John." I said, "When you're ready, I'll tell you what you're doing wrong." And he says, "This is a $2,000 machine." He said, "The only reason you found more, you just lucked out and put your detector over it." I said, "Okay." So we came back again for another hunt. And John did a little better. He found 4 mini balls by staying near me. And I found 28 artifacts for the next day's hunt. And he's beside himself. "I can't believe this. This is unbelievable. How can you do this? This place has been hunted to death." I said, "Yeah, I know, but I'm a better hunter than most of the people. And I'm not bragging in an ego way here. I'm just stating this as a fact, and I'm ready to give John everything he needs to find the same amount of relics I am, but I'm not getting through to him yet." So, and I'm telling this story, so I'm hoping some of the people listening can relate to this in a way and do things differently and start to find more. After the third hunt, I found 38 artifacts from one day's hunt. And John was looking at me and starting to copy me a little bit. And he managed to find 11 that day. That was a record for him. And he'd hunted that site for years, and never found that many in one day. And he finally submitted. He said, "Okay." He said, "Tell me what I'm doing wrong." I said, "John, you're digging a hole. It looks more like a foxhole than a mini ball recovery hole." I said, "You should be pinpointing so well that your plug is about 6 inches in diameter." And said, look at your hole right there." He was down on the ground, and he had a hole about this wide and about that deep, and there was dirt scattered everywhere. Dirt was scattered as far as 4 feet from the hole. Now, the more dirt you dig out, the more dirt you have to put back in the hole to fill it in, and it takes more time.
Yep.
What he didn't realize was he was spending probably 12 to 15 minutes per recovery to find an artifact. After he digged the hole and he no longer could get a signal in the hole, and here's all this dirt scattered around the hole, then he would take his handheld pinpointer. I do not use a handheld pinpointer. I don't need one. I've never needed one. I can pinpoint so accurately. It's a waste of time and an expense I don't need to have. It just slows you down. And I can't get that across because everybody, has bowed down to the great pinpointer god. And so they never really learn to pinpoint with their search coil. And very few people will listen to me, but the ones that have come back to me and said, "This is incredible. I can't believe it. I'm digging, my holes are so much smaller. I'm getting the stuff out of the ground." The quicker you get a find out of the ground, the sooner you're going to make the next find. The more finds, I spend 1 to 2 minutes maximum on from the time that I get a signal to the time the artifact's in my pouch. and I'm 77 years old. If I can do that, think of what you younger people with all this
Yeah.
energy can do.
Yeah.
See? So, and I pointed out to him, I said, John, keep your dirt to one side of the hole in a pile close to the hole so you can take your foot and kick it right back in. And fill that hole in something like 10 or 15 seconds, not 5 minutes to fill your hole, because you got to go out here and pull all this dirt that's 4 feet away from your hole. So he listened, and our fourth and last hunt, the poor widow lady died on us, and of course the nephew that took over the property ran us off immediately. And that's another point I tell people: if you get a good permission, don't delay. Get on it and work it. Hit it hard. Don't. You see so many of these YouTube heroes say, "Oh, I dig everything." Absolutely not. You do not dig everything. You go in there with a big coil, even if it's a junky site. You set your coil on maximum sensitivity. You don't turn your sensitivity down like everybody says to do. And you go over the site and you cherry pick it, and you get as much, like the big stuff, the big coins, the quarters, 50-cent pieces, things like that. Get those out of the ground as quick as you can, because you may lose your permission the very next week.
Oh, that's
we lost we we lost a great permission on this battlefield, another one, because some guys saw us and they illegally entered the property, left the guy's gate open, his cows got out, and the guy told us, "You're causing me trouble, so you can't hunt here either. You're drawing people." Yeah.
Terrible.
So always assume you don't have unlimited time on a great site, and work it good. Now, after you've gone over with the big coil and full sensitivity, then you can play with your sensitivity. Then you can turn it down, and you can put a smaller coil on to go between the signals and things. But that's what I always do, and it's been good enough to. And I don't consider myself a coin hunter as such. I coin hunt when I am not working a treasure project or something. I do it to keep in tune, so to speak, keep my edge. Because if you lay off detecting for months, like over the winter or something, it's going to take you a while to get your edge back to where you're really, really, you're going to be missing coins when you go out at first after a long layoff. Another mistake, and I see this all the time on Facebook posts. Oh, I got out for an hour today, and here's what I found. A few glad coins and a couple pull tabs and stuff. Listen, you don't learn your detector going out for an hour at a time. You need to go out in a minimum of 6 hours at a time if you want to learn the fastest, and you want to make the most finds, and you want to get better than everybody else. That's what you have to do. So anyway, I've kind of jumped around or gone ahead. I want to go back.
So while you've talked, you brought back some memories to me. My very first detector, my wife bought for me. It was just an old White's metal detector, all metal mode. So I had to dig everything, and I found a lot of great stuff by digging everything. But
right.
I saved up a lot of money, and I bought me a Garrett CX2, and I did not know how to use it. And I took a trip, took the family to Disneyland. We went to the beach, and I had my Garrett CX2 with me, and I was going to go find me some beach treasure. And I'm out there detecting around, and I don't know how to use this Garrett CX2. It's got all kinds of whistles and bells, and I'm used to this White's that I dig everything. It's all metal. And a guy comes up to me and he says, "Hey, I just lost my ring. Can you help me find it?" No problem.
Oh, wow.
I thought, I go over there and I'm going over everything and I don't find nothing. The bottom line is I just didn't know how to use that detector. I'd put that detector on. It had some settings for just some turn on and go settings. And you turn that, and one of the settings, and I didn't know this because I didn't know my detector. One of the settings was it notched out pull tabs. When you notch out pull tabs, you just notched out rings. There was no way I was going to find that guy's ring. There was no way I was going to find on that beach, with the settings that I put that on. So like I said, you could have the best detector in the world with all the whistles and bells, but if you do not know how to use that detector, man, you ain't going to find nothing.
Yes, you do. You're absolutely right. I use a $350 Nocta Macro Simplex is what I'm hunting with right now. And my latest find just down the road on a wooded hillside close to where there used to be a Mineral Springs resort and a 1700s tavern, I found an 1893 Spanish one real.
Cool.
Um, so that was my last silver coin find.
Cool.
Um, but yeah, and I have here on my place, I have probably one of the best test areas. I'd say it's got to be the top 10 in the whole United States. I don't know anybody else that's got one better. But I have everything. I have pennies, nickels, quarters, silver dimes, mini balls, brass buttons. I have them all in the ground in pipes, all connected, so they can't go up or down. They can't move up or down with soil or freezing. They all stay at exactly they're in the vertical pipes come off of the horizontal pipe, with fittings, and I have the coins glued in caps at the end of the pipes. So when I put them down the ground, I've got pennies at 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 inches, and then the same thing with the other coins and the mini balls. And that's part of my test area. I have a test area where I have a jar full of copper pennies, a mason jar, and I can lower it down into a pipe hole I've dug, plastic pipe, and so people can hear how a jar of coins sounds at different depths because they've never heard a jar. How are they going to know when they might have one on an old house site or something? So the idea is get people familiar with signals, and I've had guys in here, some of them with 20 or more years experience, and I've run classes uh, on what I call advanced metal detecting. And quite frankly, advanced metal detecting, what I do is I point out all the mistakes these guys been making all these years that's cost them many fines. Some of them you'd be amazed at the mistakes they're making, and sometimes we need to do. I mean, if you'd like, we need to do an interview on the 7 common mistakes that metal detectors make that robs them of more than 50% of their fines that they
Heck,
would have.
heck yeah, I'd like to. Yeah, we'll have to do that.
Yeah, and I watched the YouTube heroes, and if you hear contempt in my voice for most of them, it's because they're making these mistakes and they're teaching them to their followers. It's just unbelievable. I'll give you one example. I cannot believe how many guys that are supposed to be experts at metal detecting, when they swing their detector, it's like a pendulum on a clock. It goes up
Oh
on one end,
yeah.
down to the ground, and back up on the other end, and they're only covering about 12 inches of ground in front of them. And
Yep.
they should be swinging a flat swing, 180-degree, a half circle,
Yep.
and that way that they're covering an 8-foot section of ground.
Yep.
But that pendulum swing is amazing. And there's other common mistakes. There's six. I've cut it down to the 7 basic ones. There's more, but it's just amazing that I would really caution beginners, don't automatically assume whoever you're watching on YouTube is a real expert with metal detecting and treasure hunting. And if these guys go out and they constantly find all these incredible finds and gold coins and diamond rings and all this stuff, every YouTube episode is an amazing adventure and success in metal detecting. It's fake. It's flat out fake. They're looking to make money off of their YouTube channel. They're not looking to. They're going to keep you entertained and keep you excited, and they're not living reality. It's not a reality show, folks.
So
I,
yeah,
I,
they're picking and choosing their best finds, their only finds there, and they're putting them all. They're putting years of detecting into minutes of YouTube footage. Yeah.
well, yeah, and a lot of that, quite frankly, a lot of that stuff they find they bought. They bought.
Oh.
They bought and reburied. I mean,
Ah.
I mean, if I were that kind of a person, I could do that. I could go buy artifacts. I know where to buy. I could buy all kinds of artifacts, and I could create a Civil War campsite or something, complete with square nails in it, everything, and all but the very very best extras. They wouldn't know it was fake. They would think it was a real campsite, and that's part of the world we live in, and part of what we have to navigate it. There's certain risks both in the field and not in the field. You have to watch out for snakes and bears and things like that when you're out in the field. And if you're down in Louisiana, you have to watch out for the crocodiles and the swamps and all that. But
So
anyway,
you're talking about you got your own test site. It's professionally set up, and the reason you're doing that is because you are a professional. You learn from the professionals, but also, man, you've written, and I don't know how many news magazine articles, but I'm going to guess hundreds of magazine articles, a bunch of books. You're one of the old time professionals.
well, let's go back and let me give you a little bit of history how that all became, because I started out, like I said, like everybody else, green as a gourd. There's nothing wrong with being green as a gourd. What is wrong about it is staying green as a gourd. You want to learn as fast as possible. You want to fast track your learning curve if you really are serious about being successful over the long haul in metal detecting. Uh, don't think that there are days that I don't go out and I zero out and I come home with nothing. But I can tell you this, if I'm on a site with somebody else that's good, an old house site or something, the odds are about 90 to 10 that I'll go home with more finds than they have from my all experience. I've got probably somewhere between 7 and 8,000 hours on metal detectors. And I would like to say that with any metal detector, it takes a minimum of 100 hours of use, and not 1 hour at a time. Like I said, at least, in 6 hours, eight's better. I've spent many a day hunting 10 hours a day. Um, and I could go in, I assembled a collection of Civil War relics, over 14,000. And again, I was never a full-time Civil War relic hunter. I was never a full-time coin hunter. I found 170,000 coins. I found 14,000 Civil War artifacts in between all of my treasure hunting adventures. You and I have discussed some of them we're going to be talking about, like the Knights of the Golden Circle and things like that. So my Civil War artifacts, 90% of them came off of sites, 140 sites in 22 states. Probably 120 of those had already been hunted to death. And yet I found all those artifacts. I came out of sites. I asked, well, let me back up. I'm getting a little bit too far ahead because certain things will make sense if I give you a little more backstory.
Okay.
All right. So I got a great lesson. Learned that, I wasn't that good at finding all the coins on the site. I'd missed everything below 4 inches. Those 42 coins came out in the 6 to 8 inch range. So all I'd done was find the shallow coins. I wasn't recognizing the deep, faint signals of coins, but I did after 6 months. I had my 100 hours in on my little detects, and so I'm hunting. I'm hunting an elementary school in the neighborhood during the summer, and I'm finding a lot of good coins, buffalo nickels, mercury dimes, things like this. And it was a 1-story brick structure with rows of windows on the classrooms facing the street, and it had a hedge about 4 or 5 feet tall and about 3 feet thick, and there was a space about this wide between the hedge and the brick wall, and the top of the hedge was level with the bottom of the windows. And I got in behind that hedge, got down on my knees, and I'm detecting ahead, and I got this big signal. And Terry, I dug up a plastic sandwich bag with 300 mercury dimes in it.
Holy cow.
That was my first cache. Totally unexpected.
Cool.
How did it get there? Why was it still there? I do not know. I do not know. But that again was a lesson to me, that there's always a chance, and this is what makes it such a wonderful activity. I'm not any less enthusiastic at 77 than I was at 23. I'm still as excited about metal detecting and treasure hunting as I ever was. I just now have physical limitations on my body. It's not smart for me at 77 to go deep into the woods by myself anymore. And I'll tell you what, good hunting partners are hard to find these days.
Yeah.
Uh, I've been stabbed in the back by more than one.
Yep.
I've had sights stolen. How'd you like to take a guy in, and take him to a Civil War site that was really productive? I found 1,200 artifacts on it, and he decides to move out of town, and he shows the local treasure club exactly where the site is, and suddenly I've got 22 people hunting my site.
Terrible.
Yep. And it's worse today than it was back then when that happened. As far as
Mm.
you have to be very discreet and protect your sites, and don't be so trusting,
Yep.
because people are not as trustworthy overall as they used to be.
Sounds like you found out the hard way, and I know I've found out the hard
Yep.
way.
Well, you all usually do. That's part of the learning.
Yeah.
That's part of what makes us more expert than the beginners. Is that we've had some of those hard lessons already under our belt, so to speak. Well, I went back to National Treasure Hunters League and I upgraded to a Garrett metal detector. And it turned out, of course, Garrett's were made right there in Garland. That's where the factory was. So I had some little minor issue with the detector, and I took it over to the Garrett factory to get it repaired, get the repair people to look at it. And I just happened to hit it just right. And I met Charles Garrett, the owner, of course. And we started conversing, and I had some leads on some Spanish treasure. Actually, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. I became when I'd go out to the parks around Dallas, I'd have so many people come up to me. What are you doing? Is that things like, is that a worm detector?
Yeah.
I heard some amazing things, and everybody wanted to give it a try. And here I am, on my recreational time, wanting just to be left alone, and so I can hunt for, you find some good silver coins and things. And here's all these people, and finally I decided, well, you know what? If I'm going to have to spend all my time out detecting, having to explain what I'm doing and letting other people try it, I'm going to become a dealer. So I became a Garrett metal detector dealer, and I actually sold some metal detectors. So at least I had something to show, for the time spent with
Yeah.
these people. So I was a Garrett dealer at the time, actually, that I met Charles Garrett. Now that my memory's coming back a little clearer.